Scotland is celebrated worldwide for her natural beauty. Her wild glens and moors. Her deep lochs. Her rugged mountains and magnificent coastline. It's hard to imagine man has made any impact at all. But every square inch has been affected by centuries of human activity. I'm going to look at how man made Scotland's landscape and how this history has shaped the present.
This week, water, and how our struggle to control it has changed Scotland's landscape forever.
Scotland is waterland. There's water everywhere. In trickles, in streams, in torrents, in floods. It goes where it wants. It's free. It finds its own level. Water's half of what we think of as the Highlands. Behind the stag, the mountain and the loch. You can't have one without the other. "91% of the water in mainland Britain is here in Scotland. Loch Ness alone holds more water than all the lakes in England and Wales. The River Tay has a flow that exceeds that of the Thames. Fill your boots. It seems to me that water's who we are. It's how we sell ourselves. Endless images of Scottish lochs and rivers and burns. We use it to sell Scotland to the tourists, to anglers. We use it to sell Scottish water and even Scottish whisky. Images of untouched nature, pure and wild. But that's just advertising. The truth is, it's too wet here in Scotland, and always has been. So wet that at times in our history, it's almost starved us into submission. Taming Scotland's waters has required every ounce of our ingenuity. Feats of engineering worthy of pharaohs. We get wet and stay wet, all because of where Scotland is and its geology. Around 12,000 years ago, Scotland was covered with ice, like most of the Northern Hemisphere. And that ice, which weighed billions of tons, gouged out huge deep scratches in the mountainsides. When the ice receded, it left behind a landscape almost designed to trap and store water. And as the weather warmed, rain and mist followed snow and ice, driven by the currents and winds from the North Atlantic. Moisture-laden clouds sweeps in off the sea almost constantly. And Scotland's mountains provide those clouds with the perfect excuse to rain. To the tune of roughly 1.5 metres a year. England averages less than a metre. And as for the low-lying land, well, with that much rain, large tracts were perfect for this. Welcome to boggy Scotland. We're in Scotland's far northeast. This is a flow country, from the Norse word flaus, meaning wet. It's ancient, as old as the end of the last ice age. This is a peat bog, a blanket bog as ecologists call it. The largest in the UK. one of the largest in the world, over 4,000 square kilometres. It covers most of Scotland's far northeast. We could bury London in its entirety, but we wouldn't. I mean, that would be mean. A bog forms wherever it's damp and acid enough to favour the growth of sphagnum moss. That moss rots, it forms peat. The bog grows deeper by about 1 millimetre every year. Once, much of Scotland was like this. The flow country is an extreme example. It goes on for mile after mile. But some parts of wherever you would normally want to farm were bog or close to bog. There are fish and fowl here. You can find something to eat, enough to feed yourself perhaps. But can you farm here? No, not a chance. Too wet, too acid. Scotland's medieval inhabitants didn't even try. But even in the drier parts of the lowlands, water was still a problem. They farmed here as well as they could. They used the run rig system. Across each field, ditches were dug to drain the water from the rigs, the raised section between these ditches. And in those watery ditches grew things that liked that sort of ground. Rushes or moss. The rigs were where you grew your crops. The ditches were where you got your feet wet. A waste of space. And so things stood until the middle of the 17th century. The total population of Scotland hovered at around 1 million people, but even that was bordering on too many. In a decent year, its waterlogged fields could support 1 million mouths. But when the weather turned nasty, the country starved. Scotland's farmers experimented with new crops and techniques of fertilisation. But the real problem was obvious. Most Scots spent half their lives standing in it.
Water.
In 1696, a child was born in Berwickshire, Henry Hume. By the time he was middle-aged, Scotland had become part of a union with England, and Henry himself was a respected judge, with the title Lord Kames. But Scotland's agriculture remained dangerously vulnerable to spells of bad weather, and Lord Kames disapproved. Kames was no armchair farmer. He was an improver. He was hands-on, hands-in, I mean utterly unafraid of dung. There was a rumour that he'd tasted all kinds in his pursuit of better fertiliser. Presumably not his own. Kames, you see, had a grand vision. He took the long view, best expressed in his book, Sketches on the History of Man. He believed in progress. The hunter-gatherer was a primitive, the farmer an admirable expression of modern civilization. Agriculture is the chief of the arts, he wrote, because it combines philosophy with useful practice. Lord Kames believed that Scotland's poverty was a product of its tiny population. For a stronger economy, you needed more people. And for more people, you needed better agriculture. Bad farming, in Kames's mind, was tantamount to treason. He pronounced the death sentence on the rigged system of drainage. All land must be improved, even the most unpromising of bogs. In 1766, he got a chance to practice where he preached when his wife inherited a substantial estate near Blair Drummond, near Stirling. 1,500 acres of it were this: soggy, unproductive, impassable bog. millions of cubic yards of it. Under all that bog was good soil. But surely the removal of that much matter was a task for an Egyptian pharaoh. Kames was 70, but still he set himself a goal.
He would take 1,500 acres of lazy bog and turn it into 1,500 acres of hard-working, productive farmland.
Just a few miles from the Kames estates lies Flanders Moss, a bog that remains largely uncleared.
So how deep do you think it is?
Well, if you'd like to come over this way, we can just have a look and see.
God, it's tall already. How tall is this then?
Well, it's about 5.5, 6 metres high. And that pretty much shows us how much peat we've got below our feet.
So how hard would it have been to remove 5-6 metres of peat across this area?
Well, we know that, looking back through the archives, that George Moyer, one of the tenant farmers for an area just on the peat front over there, he cleared 11 acres of peat that was about 6 foot deep. And when you do the calculation, that's about 80,000 cubic metres of peat. So that's about 90,000 tonnes of peat that he cleared. Just a huge amount of work, absolutely huge amount of work. And when you think that people 200 years ago didn't have mechanised machines or anything like that, so they're doing it with hand tools, shovels and wheelbarrows. And so it was a lifetime's work for some of them.
Kames began work in a section where the bog was only 3 feet deep. He cut a 3-mile channel that connected the estate to the River Forth, and an enormous water wheel was built to transfer water into it from the River Teith. This channel would float the unwanted peat away. But first, someone would have to dig the unwanted peat up.
Kames advertised for tenants. He made the terms exceptionally favourable. No rent at all for the first 7 years, and then after that, it went up slowly, depending on the number of acres cleared.
The first tenant arrived in 1768. The digging started, and soon that 3-mile channel began to deliver chunks of cleared peat to the River Forth. Kames died in 1782 at the age of 86, and by that year 29 tenants and their families were living on 400 acres of former bog.
1,100 acres remained, most of it too deep to measure. Kames' son, George, sought hardier tenants, and he found them not far away in the southern highlands. Their work became monumental.
The bog was accessed by a road cut 12 feet deep into the bog itself, and the tenants made houses for themselves by cutting into the bog from the access road, allowing the walls to dry and roofing the cavity with timber provided by the estate. In 1811, after more than 30 years of work, a census revealed that the cleared section of the bog now supported 764 people on land that compared with Scotland's most fertile.
In 1840, the work was considered complete. Millions of cubic yards of peat and moss were dumped into the River Forth to float away. And for what? A strip of farmland just a few miles across. Good farmland, yes, but not a lot of it.
Kames's clearance was monumental. Monumentally inefficient. What about those lowland fields which were just wet, where the rig system still flourished? Those sorts of fields made up vastly more land than reclaiming bog could ever deliver. And the Scots had been trying to drain them for centuries.
So what is it you've hit there then?
This is a 200-year-old conde or a box drain. Just going to take one of the big stones, here, just to show you.
Oh, look at that.
It's
It's flowing quite strong, isn't it?
Aye, what's in
When I
below
lifted
here.
it the way.
If you could hold the spade,
Right.
I'll catch
Just
end
lift
of
it
it.
up.
Try and just
Oh,
keep
it's a big piece of... Look at that. That's really well built. I mean, I just thought it was going to be a whole lot of stones.
There that. Now, see this, the actual depth and the amount of water that's running down there at the moment. And if I could show you just with
Yeah, look at that.
that, and it's all stone built.
And then there's little tributaries come in, is it, that feed
there's-
into it?
Yes, in a herringbone fashion across the hollow there, down in, and this is the leader, as you would say. It comes down in here.
But you're still getting kind of waterlogged fields, aren't you? So it's not perfect, it's not doing...
Well, it's better than nothing.
All over Scotland, farmers were pouring enormous amounts of effort into beautifully made stone drains, which didn't drain enough. Because beneath the topsoil, a layer of clay would accumulate, which stopped the water reaching their drains. Beyond their soggy fields, the Industrial Revolution was gathering speed. The fathers desperately needed someone to apply some of its principles to their miserably infertile mud. They were waiting for James Smith of Deanston, an industrialist and inventor whose real love was farming. And as for me, I have an appointment with a cheese sandwich.
So what does a cheese sandwich have to do with James Smith of Deanston?
Ah, the great cheesy piece. Well, if you imagine, there's your rock, there's your subsoil,
Yeah.
and there is the devil of the piece, the hard pan of clay which had been built up.
So that's impermeable then, is it? That's the problem.
which the water can't get through it, and here's your topsoil. And the real question was, if you take this analogy of the cheesy piece, how did you get the water when it rained from there down to there?
Out of the way, yeah.
And into the drains. So what do? You run a knife through it like that.
Yeah.
You see, and what it's doing is it's cutting through the cheese,
But not disturbing below.
but it's not disturbing the bit below. And there you are. You got through.
Yeah.
And that is the same as the knife or the cooter on that.
So this
plough
is James
there.
Smith's knife, is
That's
it?
it.
This
That's
is
it.
the plough.
Smith developed a subsoil plough. Made of forged iron, it took 4 oxen to pull it, but its blade plunged through the soil to cut through the hard pan of clay. Water could now reach the drains with ease.
He developed a whole package,
Yeah.
if you like, which he published it in a book, which was Remarks on Thorough Drainage and Subsoil Ploughing.
That must have been an
which was-
epic read, that must have been.
Well, it sold, I mean, for that day and age, it sold within 10 years 25,000 copies.
Really?
Now, that was a lot.
That was
then.
a bestseller.
And the great thing about Smith's subsoil drainage was that you were able to flatten the rigs. That was when you really got the very even field surface that you
Right.
got today.
So James Smith essentially flattened Scotland's agricultural landscape.
Absolutely. He flattened it.
Flat fields were easier to farm. Flat fields could be farmed with machinery, reaping machines, harvesters. In the drier soil Smith's plough created, growing seasons were longer and crops were less subject to rot. Water was beginning to do our bidding. Agricultural productivity increased. And with it, so did Scotland's population. Lord Kames had always wanted that to happen, but he had hoped for a society in which towns were civilised and small. By the 1840s, Scotland held more than 2.5 million people, and Glasgow was a swollen city of 280,000. Its people lived in houses and streets of almost unequalled squalor and filth. The city drew water from increasingly polluted wells and from the River Clyde itself.
You know, this was a dumping ground for industrial effluent refuse and animal and human sewage. The water Glaswegians drank, the water they bathed in, was famously the colour of coffee.
Just one block inland is Argyll Street, one of Glasgow's busiest shopping streets. In the 19th century, between Argyll Street and the Clyde, the poorest residents used to make heaps of their own excrement, mix them with ash, and sell the result as fertiliser.
So thanks to our mastery of the drainage of lowland farms, this is what we'd achieved. Population so large that it soiled itself. Soiled the streets that it lived in and the water that it needed to drink.
Which led to epidemics. 3,000 deaths from cholera in 1832. 4,000 twice in 1847 and 1848. And more thousands lost their lives in 1853.
This is the Glasgow necropolis, the city of the dead, which was opened in 1831. And here's the southern necropolis in Glasgow's Gorbals, which was opened 1840. Which is the same year that this was founded. Sight Hill Cemetery. The eastern necropolis, which runs right up to the walls of Parkhead, home of Celtic Football Club, was laid out in 1847. There's a lot of dying going on in Glasgow.
Between 1820 and 1840, the average life expectancy in the city fell from 35 to 27 years, and its population almost doubled. Hence the need for these new cemeteries. The old ones were full to the brim and beginning to stink. The city needed access to massive quantities of clean water. Without it, Glasgow would fill all these new cemeteries with horrifying speed. The survival and future growth of one of the Empire's leading industrial cities was at stake. The idea that Glasgow could pipe water from somewhere unsoiled by bulk humanity was first mooted in 1852. Parties of surveyors were sent out to assess the suitability of the various lochs that lay along the southern edge of the Highlands. And Glasgow hired a man whose expertise in supplying water to cities was unsurpassed. John Frederick Latrobe Bateman.
Bateman was a god of water, and he knew it. Latrobe was actually his mother's maiden name. He added it to his own by deed poll to make his sufficiently big. And for Glasgow, he chose this loch as the perfect candidate to provide the city with clean water. Loch Catron.
Its waters are exquisitely clear. Oh, it's delicious. Loch Catron was 34 miles north of Glasgow. But for John Frederick Latrobe Bateman, the distance was less of a problem than the rock he would have to tunnel through.
of these gorgeous layers and swirls. It's kind of like Italian ice cream gone mad. You can just feel the whole rock flowing. But although this looks soft and squidgy, it was actually baked and squeezed several miles below my feet when there was a big mountain range above my head. And then that was slowly stripped away to reveal, well, some of the hardest rocks on the planet. And this is what they had to drill, tunnel and hack their way through.
Some of the rock was so hard that only 3 yards could be drilled through in a month. 4 inches a day. 3,000 workers were needed to construct the tunnels and aqueducts that would eventually bring clean water to Glasgow. A temporary village was built to house them.
The locals actually called it Sebastopol after the famous battle in the Crimean War because of the constant sound of explosions. It's hard to believe in a day like today.
Katrin was just one of a chain of lochs. Left to nature, its waters flowed out through 2 others, towards the east coast. It was Bateman's job to rewrite nature. Using dams, he would turn Katrin into a reservoir and send its waters southwards. It needed to be at least 4 feet deeper to meet Glasgow's needs. So that water would have to come from the other lochs in the system.
Loch Arklet, which flowed into Loch Katrin, would have to be increased in size as well. But great care was taken to ensure that everything was as impressive as possible, which led to the construction of buildings like these. These contained the valves to the dam. Clearly a Scotsman's valve house is his castle.
None of the dams were allowed to be unpleasant to look at. Ugly was unacceptable.
This dam was decorated in fashionable ornamentation in the neoclassical style. And once it was in place, the level of Loch Katrin went up by the required 4 feet. It was a masterclass in Victorian efficiency and panache.
For part of its journey, the water would be transported in pipes like these, 4 feet in diameter. The hills are littered with 159-year-old spares. The 3,000-strong workforce would build 26 iron and stone aqueducts, 44 ventilation shafts, 70 tunnels.
I love this place. I can't tell you what it is. It's a secret. It's about 5 miles from Loch Katrin, but the main reason for coming here is this. This is one of the few places where you can actually see the water flowing. It is so clear. It's going really fast in that direction, towards Glasgow. And I wouldn't like to fall in there.
The supply descended at a carefully measured gradient of 10 inches per mile and was entirely driven by gravity. There were no pumps, and the engineering was of such accuracy that the separate sections of tunnel, excavated by different teams, met seamlessly. And the waters flowed, filling a specially constructed reservoir a few miles west of Glasgow. The work was complete, but this was the 19th century. The entire project could hardly be said to exist until it had been sprinkled with generous amounts of pomp and circumstance. And the only appropriate place to do the pumping was back at Loch Katrine itself.
The opening ceremony took place on Friday the 14th of October 1859. It rained all morning, so no surprise there. But the ceremony was properly Victorian. The intakes at Loch Katrine were positively imperious. And the Queen herself turned up with her husband, Prince Albert, to turn on what amounted to the ceremonial tap, made of solid silver.
Which waited for her beneath a rustic shelter at the end of a walkway covered in red velvet. There was a 21-gun salute, a ceremonial lunch, and lots of speeches.
One of the speeches that day was given by John Frederick Latrobe Bateman. "I leave you a work as indestructible as the hills through which it's been carried," he said. "A truly Roman work which surpasses the greatness of the 9 famous aqueducts which fed the city of Rome, of the works of ornament and usefulness for which your city is distinguished. None will be more creditable to you than the Loch Katrine waterworks."
This fountain in Glasgow's Kelvin Grove Park commemorates the arrival in March of 1860 of a clean water supply for most of the city. Legend has it that some of Glasgow's poorer citizens were less than pleased.
They complained that the new water had nae smell and nae taste. But at least they were alive. When cholera again struck the city in 1863, there were less than 100 deaths.
All of Scotland's towns and cities followed Glasgow's example. Lochs became glorified drinking fountains.
By the 1860s, the Scots had drained their fields so they could support cities like these. And they piped clean water to those cities so the people who lived there could live without fear of waterborne diseases. This was victory. And now Scots could go further. They could do things with water because there was money to be made, or just because they could.
Nature could no longer stand in the way of progress. Water was no longer a threat. It was an abundant resource. But for what? Most of Scotland's water was in the Highlands, where people were increasingly in short supply. Sheep farms and private hunting estates were squeezing them out. Queen Victoria adored the Highlands. They were a nice place to visit, fish, shoot. But no one thought the Highlands were good for anything else.
There was hardly any reason to grow crops in the Highlands. I mean, there were very few people to feed. And as for industry, I mean, why would you bring it here?
There was a great deal of nothing in the Highlands, apart from water. Water that had no purpose apart from being beautiful. Or so it seemed until the 1880s.
In 1882, at an exhibition in Munich, scientists gave a demonstration. They delivered electricity, carried by wire over a distance of a mile, and generated by a turbine powered by the flow of a river. hydroelectric power.
In 1890, the surprisingly hip Benedictine monks of a monastery near Loch Ness installed something more permanent. The 18-kilowatt hydroelectric turbine would power the organ in their chapel. This was the very tiniest hint of what was to come. Thanks to the Ice Age and the Atlantic Ocean, the Highlands were perfect for hydropower. There was lots of water, and it was high above sea level. That height would generate even more power as the water fell to enter the turbines.
But what was the point? I mean, why bother building large hydroelectric power plants in Scotland? I mean, it's not as if there were hundreds of Benedictine monasteries all over the Highlands, all with church organs desperate for electric power. There just simply wasn't the demand. Which brings me, naturally enough, onto the subject of aluminium.
Aluminium. The most abundant metal in the Earth's crust. The third most abundant element of any kind. Usually found as an ore called bauxite.
It was easy to get this stuff out of bauxite. Alumina, aluminium oxide. But to get pure aluminium, that was much, much harder. But just easy enough to make it clear that it was useful. It was also extortionately expensive to make, something like 20 quid a pound. Until 1885, aluminium was a precious metal.
But in that year, 2 new processes were announced. They reduced the cost of producing aluminium to as little as 4 shillings per pound. And they both used an electric current to make it all happen.
All that was required was an abundant supply of cheap electricity. And the only technology in the 1880s that would fit the bill was hydroelectric power.
Aluminium was strong and light. It didn't rust. It could be used in canning, cookware, construction. It would become fundamental to consumer society. Suddenly, all that uselessly beautiful water in the Highlands was useless no more. It was a kind of alchemy. There was money everywhere. In trickles, in streams, in torrents, in floods. Money waiting to be made. In the 1890s, the British Aluminium Company bought up 8,000 acres of land beside Loch Ness, around the Falls of Foyers. The Falls of Foyers were a beauty spot. Since the end of the 18th century, people had been coming to Loch Ness just to see them, and draw them, paint them, photograph them. But the British Aluminium Company wasn't interested in the beauty. They wanted power for an aluminium smelter. And here, above the falls themselves, The waters that fed them collected conveniently and could easily be diverted to their new hydro plant.
Less water would flow to the falls, of course. They would become less beautiful. But that was the price of progress. Industry had come to the Highlands.
British aluminium had brought jobs, possibly even prosperity, to an area that had been poor since the 18th century. And they did what they could to hide the scars, burying the pipes that stole the water. But for some, the reduction of the falls was 3,750 kilowatts of vandalism, a crime against beauty. Clearly, there was no pleasing some people. So British aluminium went on to bigger things. Much bigger. Construction began here near Kinloch Leven in 1904. The workforce, 3,000 strong, many of them Irish navvies, had no idea what they were building. They called it the waterworks. In reality, they were flooding an entire glen, making one loch out of 3, with a dam that was over half a mile long. The Blackwater Reservoir, 75 feet deep, 9 miles in length, would eventually contain 24,000 million gallons of water.
The working conditions were terrifying. I mean, labourers risked life and limb for just 6 pence an hour, plus overtime. They lived in wooden huts, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed, with just a single stove for heat. In those days, there was no contempt for health and safety. There was no health and safety.
People fell into the holes they'd excavated. People died in accidents with dynamite, collateral damage. The accidents were frequent enough that in the end, a graveyard was established here.
The headstones are made of concrete, which wasn't exactly in short supply.
There was no attempt this time to disguise the pipes. They ran down to a plant in the village of Kinloch Leven, to machines that would generate almost 24,000 kilowatts of power. Just over 20 years since the monks of Fort Augustus built something to run a church organ.
More jobs for Highlanders, more unsightly industries in the Highlands' heart, more money, more liquid metal and liquid cash. Aluminium production took place in Scotland on such a scale that only the excessive demands of World War I outstripped supply.
British aluminium had proved that there was power in abundance in Scotland's lochs and rivers. But most of it remained untapped until the next war, until 1941. In that year, Winston Churchill appointed Tom Johnstone Secretary of State for Scotland. Johnstone was a Scottish patriot and lifelong socialist. He saw Scotland's waters as an opportunity for social engineering. He wanted to help the impoverished Highlanders, still living in houses that were Modcon-free, with many of their sons fighting the Nazis as soldiers in the 51st Highland Division. Johnston would take control of Scotland's entire water system, and with hydropower, he would make homes fit for heroes. There were objections in Parliament from private power companies and the landed gentry. Tom Johnston took them outside, and the North of Scotland Hydroelectricity Board was born in 1945 and blessed with a coat of arms.
And here it is. What I really love about it, that red-winged thunderbolt right in the middle, sending out flashes of lightning. And just below it, the old oil lamp, the lighting that Hydro's going to replace. Up here in Gaelic is the motto, Niashna Glan, power from the glens.
The first target for the Hydro Board was close at hand. Just 20 miles north of Glasgow lay Loch Lomond.
And more than 700 feet above Loch Lomond is Loch Sloy.
Sloy was high enough, but far from big enough. Water ran to waste for miles around. It must be caught and forced to flow into Sloy. Work began in June of 1945. It was hampered by appalling weather and post-war shortages of almost everything. "200 German prisoners of war were drafted in to assist. By the time the project was complete, Loch Sloy had increased in depth by 155 feet, doubled in length, and collected rainfall from an area 4 times larger than it had before. Water flowed down a tunnel driven through Ben Vorlich,
And then it flowed through these.
In 1951, power began to flow at last from the Glens to Glasgow, and Tom Johnston ensured that it went to the Highlanders too. No one questioned whether or not this croft or any other was worth the miles of cable needed to connect them. Profit wasn't the point, the people were. Thanks to the Hydro Board, ovens and fridges could be more to a crofter than a newfangled lump of inanimate metal, and light could come and go at the flick of a switch. Sloy was just a start, and as the Hydro Board did its work, more and more lochs and rivers throughout the Highlands came under its control. "49 dams, and almost 30 years later, we come to Ben Cruachan, the second last and largest in output of the Hydro Board's installations.
It's not built beside a mountain, it's inside a mountain. Almost 1,000 feet above me is an artificial loch. That's because Ben Cruachan here is a pumped storage system. In other words, after each run of its turbines, the water gets pumped up to the loch and it's ready to run again.
Which means that Ben Cruachan is ready to provide power whenever it's needed most. And power on demand is now the model for the entire hydropower industry. More than 60 years after their installation, the machines at Sloy look brand new, neatly painted in Lego reds and blues. But they aren't running. Coal and nuclear powered stations have to run continuously. Hydropower slumbers, waiting for the moments of greatest electrical need. And all of Scotland's hydro stations are now remotely controlled.
We here at Sloy do not know when they're going to start, when they're going to stop. We have control engineers sit in Perth They, with the demand, they will start the sets around the country.
Yeah.
This actual set could start just now as we're standing on it.
And you
we
would
don't know. We would just hear the set starting up.
So you get a funny perspective on British culture, really. As soon as demand's out there, these things start to whir into action.
That's what happens. We see, you know, especially when JR gets shot and somebody gets killed in Coronation Street.
You see it here.
This all starts up.
God, it's amazing. They might just be on for half an hour or so then.
They might only run for 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
They can run as little as 5 minutes just to meet that extra demand to make sure the system's kept up to the level it's required.
I kind of want it to start. Can't we create a demand somewhere in the country and it can
If you
start?
can go and phone somebody and say,
Get EastEnders on.
get something on, they would
That's
start.
great. I really want to experience it.
But I can't. As Don says, when the hydro plants run is out of his hands. And the command goes out only when the power generated can be sold for the highest possible price. Thanks to hydropower, every major body of water and every major river in the Scottish Highlands is blocked by dams diverted into reservoir catchments. And now the levels of all those lochs and reservoirs go up or down according to the market, pegged to the price of electricity. The truth of Scotland's water is simply this: the only thing that happens naturally is rain. As soon as that rain hits the ground, it's ours, and we do with it what we will. The waters of Scotland are among the most managed on earth. And management, by its very human nature, is never perfect. Goodbye, River Garry.
So this is a Gary.
Well, that indeed is the River Garry, or rather what's left of it. The whole lot accumulates in here and all goes down this plug hole here and goes through another tunnel to Loch Erichty, several miles away through the hill.
So that's what it was beforehand. What does it look like now then?
Well, if you come across
it's
here...
kind of different.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can see here, Ian, all the water is gone. There is not a drop of water in the river.
God.
Every single vestige.
So what's the route of this water now?
The water here at this intake goes through into Loch Erichty, which then goes through another tunnel into Loch Tummel, and from there through Clooney Power Station, then to Pitlochry Dam, and into the River Tummel, and from there it flows down to the Tay at Perth.
I'm lost. It's like a London Underground map or something.
Well, it is. I mean, in actual fact, it's like a spider's web of abstraction. If you wanted to actually butcher up a river, you could not have done a better job than they've done here, quite honestly.
It kind of makes a mockery of this idea of all the rivers you see on the maps. They're not there, are they? There's a secret river system, isn't there?
There is indeed a secret river system, absolutely.
God.
So, since hydropower did its work, the River Garry has become a nice place for a walk. It used to be one of the finest salmon rivers in the country. I can't see many salmon today, and I don't think it's just because it's the wrong season.
It seems almost certain that under new European Union regulations that at least part of the Garry will be re-watered. But in a way, all that proves is that in this micromanaged river and loch system we've created, there's only ever such a thing as a River Garry if we choose to switch it on.
The River Garry is only unusual in that it's switched off completely for a large stretch. Almost all of Scotland's rivers are under this kind of fingertip control. They depend for water on what the management allows. Once the needs of hydropower production have been satisfied, Scotland's rivers get what's left over. Compensation water is the technical term. When they need to be bigger, for entertainment purposes for instance, a larger river can be arranged.
They run like trains with a timetable. I mean, take the River Tummel, for instance. Most summers it's on weekend release. Every Friday at 4 p.m, someone comes up here to Clooney Dam, possibly with a spanner, and opens the floodgates and leaves them open until 8 o'clock on Monday morning.
At the weekends, the switched-on Tummel isn't a river anymore. It's a flume. a theme park ride.
This is Scotland, a land of burns and rivers, of lovely lochs and noble vistas. Its newfound power rooted in its ancient hills.
When I was at school, they showed us films like this in geography. Rivers at work. Our control of water was a source of national pride. After all, we'd cleared millions of tons of bog, drained and flattened our fields, supplied clean water to our cities. We'd turned our excessive rainfall from a fact of life into a source of electrical power. It was a success story. It still is. It's where we go next that's a problem. At this end of the island, Scotland's still wet. Should always have been the birthplace of the umbrella. But at the other, southern England is now desperately dry. And some people say we should build a national water grid to send our surplus south. Which sounds mad, but it's already happening elsewhere. Israel depends heavily on imported water, and a pipeline hundreds of miles long is projected to supply it from Turkey. And the water-poor southwest of America is discussing a similar arrangement with Canada. So a national water grid for Scotland and England isn't in fact outlandish at all. For us to do that, of course, we'd have to subject Scotland's rivers to even tighter control. And maybe you're a bit like me, a wee bit worried to see a river that depends for its existence on a man with a spanner. But I can worry as much as I like. It's far too late for that. It's been too late since Glasgow's taps first flowed with the waters of Loch Katrine. Scotland's water has been working ever since. There's too much to undo. Cities, waterworks, aluminium foil in cans, airplanes and alloy wheels, electric lights and ovens, kettles, peak time television, power showers and baths, hand basins, toilets, all depend on Scotland's water system staying exactly the way it is. Beautiful. And damned.
Coming up next here on BBC HD, the week's new releases get the Film 2010 treatment with Claudia Winkleman. That's in just a few moments. And then there's comedy from 10 past 10 as QI goes supersize.